whose families are inside Tibet right now, and they cannot contact them, they cannot go to Tibet because China systematically denied visa even to Tibetan Americans. And I came to know that we have members from Taiwanese community here, Falun Gong practitioner, and Chinese community. So all of us are really concerned. And we are hearing the news because this coming March 10th is the 60th Tibetan National Uprising Day. And we are hearing news that inside Tibet, in Lhasa, the travel has been banned. Foreigners cannot go. There's restrictions mounting in. And you might have also heard about the news of the critical news, what is happening inside Xinjiang, also known as East Turkestan. Over 1 million people are behind the concentration camp. And imagine, it is happening right now. Families are missing, children are missing, and it is happening under the Chinese communist regime, under the Xi Jinping's rule. And the person who has implemented this policy, especially Chen Guangguo, the current Communist Party secretary of the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, Uyghur Autonomous Region, who is particularly responsible for this gross violation of human rights, was also responsible for similar atrocity in Tibet when he was then the party secretary in Tibet. As soon as he became the party secretary, he had repressed religious freedom in Tibet, implementing a new security policy which divided urban centers into grids, giving authorities the means to systematically surveil all activities within the areas, and instituting new biometric identification cards. So these are all happening inside Tibet, inside to the Uyghur people. And in China, you also know that how people are being suppressed for the democracy and for the freedom. So we are concerned that these stories, these informations are now being censored in the free world, in the United States. We have report that our members from Students for Free Tibet are told that you cannot discuss, and panels have also expressed how these issues are being censored here. In 2009, His Holiness Dalai Lama talk at the NC stage was banned, and that was because of the advice from the Confucius Institute in the college, in the university. And you can understand someone like His Holiness, who is respected as the leader for peace and compassion, are being stopped to share the concern and to share the message to the international community. So because of those censorship, as former speaker mentioned, that how now the Confucius Institute is being shut down in universities, the coalition of the human rights advocate and community members in Portland has written to the president of the PSU. We haven't had the reply. It's been almost a month, and there will be a lot of follow-up discussion on that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And then, the issue of PSU-CI. So we know that PSU-CI, it was established in 2007. And then it helped establish 32 Confucius classrooms in local K-12 schools, in Oregon. And then, I want to ask Jennifer to offer us some information about what has been going on with the PSU-CI and contract renewal and things like that from the PSU side.
Okay, so hi, I'm Jennifer Ruth, and I'm professor of film, but I'm here more because I sit on Committee A for the National Organization of American Association of University Professors. So one of the things, I will answer your question, Yu-Xiao, about what's happening here in a second, but let me give a little bit of context, which is one of the things that makes this issue so particularly tricky at this moment is that many of us are not particularly proud of our government at this moment, and our government is xenophobic and is anti-immigrant and stuff. So, but in 2014, so 5 years ago, National AAUP looked at this, so well before the Trump era, National AAUP looked at this and recommended that universities terminate their association unless universities can have more control over the hiring process and making and ensure that academic freedom isn't compromised on American soil, right? So that was in 2014. One of the things I want to mention too is that Rachel, I think you would be open in saying that your organization is more associated with conservatism.
We're nonpartisan, but we get labeled conservative.
Okay, we're nonpartisan and we get labeled liberal left. The AAUP. So AAUP is the national faculty organization that's associated with liberal left, and Rachel's organization is associated with conservative. This is a bipartisan issue, or a non-partisan issue. Both Republicans and Democrats have issues with the Confucius Institute. I would also just want to mention, and I know that I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence here. There's so many different varying levels of knowledge about this issue or understanding about this issue. So each of you might be coming from such a total different place, so this may be so obvious to you. But it's also certainly not about communism versus capitalism, right? It's about a one-party state that doesn't allow for toleration of minorities, religious freedom, academic freedom, intellectual freedom, etc. And we're not a one-party state, thank God, as of yet, here in America. And the difference between, so for example, I've done 2 Fulbrights in China. When I did Fulbrights in China, I am left, and I would tell the Chinese students how much I hated George Bush all the time. They cannot say that they hate Xi Jinping when they come here, right? There's a fundamental difference. And the question, the other thing that I want to just mention, because I think it's a sticking point for a lot of people, is if we say no to one country, we're not saying, by the way, we're not saying no to one country, but that's the way it gets sort of reduced, right? It gets turned into, if we say no to one country, we're going to have to say no to our collaborations with every authoritarian state or every state that has any kind of human rights issues. That's not the issue here. We have a Middle East Studies Center on PSU campus. It's run entirely by a PSU professor who has control over the decisions the program makes, what kinds of funding channels work, what students apply to. Confucius Institute is not that. We have scholars of China in PSU. We have an Institute of Asian Studies. It's not beholden to Hanban in any way, and it's not run by Hanban. It's run by our own experts, some of whom may have been, born and raised elsewhere, are permanent residents or citizens now, whatever. So it's a question of how it's organized and how much control different groups have and whether academic freedom is possible. Okay, so PSU AAUP, I'm the Vice President of Academic Freedom and Grievances for our local Portland State Union. And we supported a Senate resolution that was just passed. The Senate resolution that was passed followed the national, my umbrella organization, AAUP's recommendation, which asked for universities to not renew contracts unless control over hiring and academic freedom was ensured. So the faculty senate, so there's sort of 2 different kinds of bodies. The union body, which represents academic professionals and faculty, and the faculty senate, which also, it's non-union, but it's PSU's faculty senate that represents faculty and academic professionals. So the union supported the Senate to pass this resolution, and the resolution did pass. And right now, the administration is in negotiations with Hanban over changing the contract language. And things are pending right now. I have very deep concerns, and I speak just for myself here, because PSU AAUP, we have to support the Senate process all the way through and not second guess it ahead of time, right? It's still ongoing. We don't know how this is going to turn out. I don't want to assume that Senate is not going to do due diligence. I don't want to assume that. Nonetheless, if you don't know a lot about this, if you haven't seen Doris's film, if you have language that says, sure, the instructors can have academic freedom, but you don't have language that says, okay, but we're going to control the hiring. We're going to have an actual person they may be of Chinese descent, but they're American citizens or whatever. They're academics, and they're specifically in this area, as opposed to just happen to be from China and thus have a kind of patriotism to China. Right? There's a difference for a university. Confucius Institutes can be standalone things that teach Chinese language. It's a different thing when you say it's a university thing, affiliated with university having academic kind of status. It needs to be handled differently. So it's pending right now. We'll see. I'm not very hopeful from the conversations I've had with the provost, with the current director of the Confucius Institute. They've been very hostile from the beginning, very defensive, but we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, and I want to also add a few things from my observation. So in an article in Inside Higher Ed in July last year, it disclosed that our PSU-CI director, was actually cited as an exemplary case of implementing all this censorship on university campus, because our CI director said that we cannot organize like discussions about Tiananmen Square. I mean, they said they don't even say it's a massacre, although we know it was, right? So anyway, so Tiananmen Square discussions and the Falun Gong discussion, they don't want to organize because these are the topics that the Han or the Chinese regime does not want us to talk about. So she was cited inside higher ed as an exemplary case because it said in the article that typically it's just self-censorship, but we have an exemplary case, which is our PSU-CI. And also, I did a little bit of probing because I think the religious persecution issue in China is really severe, and we needed some discussion about it. So I asked the PSU-CI to sponsor an event like that. It was last December, and the response was, well, we have to put it on agenda for like every time if you want to host any events, it has to be approved by Han, which means that, like Han, the communist regime, they have to approve the events. Otherwise, the PSU-CI cannot, sponsor or provide money for that. Then a follow-up email to them, I said, look, I'm just asking you to advertise, right? So I'm not even asking you for money, but you have the CI, maybe an email list or something. You can be listed as a sponsor and you can send it through the email to promote this event. But there was no response from the CI. So from my point of view, I don't see that the censorship, like the censorship inside the higher ed article, that was a communication with PSU-CI in 2011. So, and my experiment really was last December. So I don't think that the censorship at PSU, through the CI has stopped. And I don't think I have any reason to believe it will stop after the contract renewal. So that's why, I feel really it is important to have this discussion today, because, these are the real concerns and issues. And then, I think we should always think about it. And between money and fundamental values, what do we make the choice, right? So you have to choose one. Which one do you pick? And I have one last question. Then I'm going to open it to the floor. I know that many other countries also have language, promote their own culture. So, for example, in UK there's British Council, and in France our alliances, Francis. So those are also cultural exchange programs, but why is the Chinese government's Confucius Institute gets all this criticism? Why not the others?
So, I think a lot of people, when they don't know much about the Confucius Institutes, they often confuse Confucius Institutes as the same thing as Alliance Française, Gautier Institute, or British Council, but in fact, they are not. They're fundamentally different in two ways. One, the other language and cultural promotional institutions are independent from their governments. Although their own governments provide funding to them, but they operate. They have total control of how they operate its institution. But the Confucius Institute is 100% controlled and funded by the Chinese government. According to the bylaws and constitutions of the Confucius Institute's headquarters in Beijing, Hanban is under Education Ministry. Hanban oversees each and every Confucius Institute and Confucius classroom, but above Hanban, there is a council. And the chair of the council is a current vice premier of the People's Republic of China, which I was called PRC. And she's also the current member of Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party, which I will call CCP. So she is the top 25 guys in China in CCP. And she was also a former chair of the United Front Work Department, which Rochelle mentioned. And that organization is verified and then seen by the intelligence community across the world. as the spying agency of the CCP. And so that under the chair, there are a few vice chair plus some more than 10 executive members sit in that council. All those members are either high-ranking officials of various departments of the PRC or the high-ranking directors of the CCP, including education, foreign affairs, finance, information control, the internet control and publication in CCTV and the United Front. So it's a cross-governmental, cross-departments effort trying to control everything happening in the CI and CC, and that council gives directives to Hanban, which through Hanban to implement in each and every CC and CI. So that's number one. Number two, the model for CI, as you've seen, it has to be hosted by a foreign university or a foreign school board. And even within the foreign universities, the CIs or CC, they are not standalone or institution. They have to be hosted by a department or a school in that university. And this model is totally different than the other organizations just named. Those are standalone. They have their own premises. They either own or rent property in foreign country. But CIs doesn't own any property. They are actually strategically being seeded or attached or embedded to a foreign education institution. And I guess understand what the purpose for the Chinese government to choose this model, which is to exert influence from within a foreign education system. So this is a very smart model. Before the Chinese government invented the CI initiative, they had studied all the other foreign language and culture promotional institutions already. So they purposefully chose or invented this model. And we have seen there have been no shortages of the examples of CIs or CC. They censor certain topics. The host universities or schools, oftentimes they do self-censor as well. And in their textbooks, there are a lot of propagandistic elements in that. So, and it's not only in United States, it's in Canada, it happened in Canada, Australia, many other countries. So it's not isolated or individual cases. So that's why I think the CIs got criticisms or concerns all the time.
All right, we'll just open it up for questions from the floor.
It sounds to me the universities in here, for example, or in Canada, they have no power to influence this Chinese decisions.
Excuse me, can you speak to your microphone? Yeah, because we are doing a live recording. Yeah. Just speak to
My question is that while watching the film and listening to you, I don't really hear any control exerted on this Chinese policy by counterpart, like in this case PSU or the university in Canada. How come? Why are we so weak? Why are we so weak against Chinese policy?
Yes. Because we can then have free China, from the university standpoint, Mandarin language classes that we don't have to pay for. We can have materials that we don't have to pay for. Our students can apply for travel. This is a hard one, right? I want our students to be able to travel as much as possible. But it's money, and the problem is that administrators tell themselves, the minute I think there's a problem with censorship, we can't become reliant on the money. But as you saw in the film, someone says something like, once the money's there, it's extremely hard to take it away. And that's the reality.
And just to emphasize,
the amount of money, the Senate report that just came out last week found that China has spent $158 million on Confucius Institutes in the United States. That's a lot of money, especially at liberal arts programs where $100,000 it can make a big difference, especially at small colleges and universities. And for universities, it's not just funding to be able to teach these classes, but then also if they're offering these classes for credit, as many Confucius Institutes do, then students are also paying tuition for classes that cost the university nothing. And that funding is, it makes a big deal. As far as universities trying to exert control, another thing that came out of this Senate study is universities trying to push back on some of the restrictive requirements that Hanwhan puts out, and Hanwhan shut them down, said, no, we will not sign this amended contract. I'll be really interested to see what happens with Portland State University. Maybe Hanwhan has gotten so much bad press that they figure we've got to amend it somehow just to keep it open, but I think there really is no safe way to operate a Confucius Institute. There is no safe way to put in enough safeguards to ensure that the influence is not going to be there. The kinds of problems that we're pointing to with universities not having full control of the hiring procedures, accepting these textbooks printed by the Chinese government, accepting this funding, I consider each of those symptoms of the problem and not the primary problem itself. They're symptoms of the problem in which China is trying to, again, make the foreign serve China, make foreign institutions be influenced by the Chinese government's efforts. And so you can put in as many parchment barriers and paper requirements saying academic freedom will be fully respected here, but I am not confident that China would actually respect those agreements, and my concern is that the university, in putting that language in, is just giving itself a safeguard, something to point to on paper and say, whatever happens with Confucius Institutes elsewhere, well, here at least on paper we have this policy saying we are not guilty, we are not complicit in any of that, even if the same problems still remain.
Right, just as the guy I interviewed in the film, just give you one number about how the Chinese government has been spending on the CI across the world. It's more than 2 billion, and the real number should be larger than that because there is lack of number for the first 2 years and the last year. There's no budget spent. No public number to show how much the Chinese government have been spending on this. But 2 billion, more than 2 billion.
Yeah, I think to that question, one thing that we need to understand is the awareness on this issue is lacking. And I commend Doris, this film, which is really exposing what Confucius Institute is doing. I met a lot of leaders, elected leaders. When we speak about this concern, they don't know. And these contracts are signed secretly, and there's a clause that they cannot reveal the contract to people. And of course, if you are a student or a member of the PSU, you can ask your authority about the clause. And in the clause, it mentioned about respecting the law of Chinese government. And we know that Chinese government right now, anything against freedom or the preservation of the religious community, and they're trying to implement here in that way. And also, just to add on, I really commend the Faculty Senate concern and the people that are raising this issue, and also about the contract. We know that and other speakers have mentioned as well, senior Communist Party officials such as Li Chengchu, former Politburo Standing Committee member, and CCP China's propaganda chief from 2002 to 12. And she said that, and quote, Confucius Institute is an important part of China's overseas propaganda setup. And when we speak here, as a Tibetan, I really value and respect Chinese culture, Chinese language. And of course, we need to learn it, and there's no second thought on that. But they bring those censorship here, and as a Tibetan community, we are concerned because we have faced a lot of tragedy in our country, and the oppression and repression is happening right now, as I explained before. And now these discussions are being censored here. And I think that is concerning as well. So yeah, so I feel like, as I also agree on the other speakers, like, no matter what amendment we do in the contract, it's going to be very difficult. The whole setup itself is a false, and we need to really rethink again. And as other universities are stepping in, it is time to end the contract and then also have another space how we can teach Chinese language and culture in the United States.
Hi. So in the documentary, I saw doing lots of the footage about the protests and counter-protests regarding the CI. So I saw like a lot of the people, like a lot of the Chinese, apparently Chinese students or like Chinese American or like overseas Chinese, like waving Chinese flags and like yelling and stuff. So like, and also there was that lady from the Confucius Institute, or no, sorry, from the Overseas Chinese Association, and she said, or it was like, I forgot if it was her, but it was in her orders to like from the Chinese regime saying that they had to organize parades to whenever China's interests were being affected, or were so-called China's interests, actually the party's interests were being threatened. So like, so it seems like this kind of like mobilization of overseas Chinese and Chinese international students is pretty common. Has that happened here? And is that, and also how does that fit into the broader mission of the CIs?
Right, thanks for the question. As you saw I think on the campus, foreign university campus, along with Confucius Institute, which is a major soft power tool used by the PRC, there's another organization named Chinese Students and Scholar Association, in short CSSA. That's another organization. I believe each and every foreign university has that organization, and that organization, by and large, listens to local Chinese consulate or embassy, and it's also receive funding from the Chinese consulate and embassy. For example, just last month in University of Toronto, which is the top 3 university in Canada, the Chinese students in that university protest the newly elected chair of the student union, who happens to be a Tibetan girl. And the Chinese students, through that organization, and invented an online petition and kind of bullying online, and request that new chair to be resigned or to be removed from the post, just because she is pro-Tibet independence. And right now, the Toronto police is investigating this online bullying and trying to find out if the Chinese government does hide behind the Chinese students. And similar things happen in another Canadian university as well. But in America, I know in February 2017, I believe so, in University of UC San Diego University, there was the Holiness Dalai Lama was invited to speak on campus, but the Chinese students, again through that CSSA organization, protest that decision of the university, and I believe eventually the speak was cancelled. Was cancelled? No, not was cancelled.
Speak, but under immense protest.
Yeah, immense protest. That's there's some other examples as well. I think the foreign university is not safe while we are welcoming more and more Chinese students coming in, which in a way is good because inside China is heavily controlled and internet was policed and blocked. Chinese people are facing huge challenge accessing free information. So sending Chinese people or tourists or whoever Chinese from mainland to outside of mainland, which will provide those Chinese people an opportunity to be opened, exposed to free information. That's a good side, but the downside would be the Chinese people like myself, I was born and grown up in China, and I had my education in China, university education in China. So the propaganda and brainwashing is it's on daily basis. It's part of our life. Just tell you, if here a kid singing a kid song, and then in China we sing those red song praising the Communist Party or praising the Chinese government. That's part of our life, and there's no way you escape from that. So my point is, the downside with more and more Chinese population pouring to the foreign countries would be the brainwashed Chinese, like you saw in my film, who came out to support the Confucius Institute in Toronto, would bring the propaganda with them, and they themselves, many of them themselves are living propaganda. They don't know that. They don't know that until one day they suddenly wake up. But it's not all Chinese like that. Please just make a distinction, like myself and many others who do understand the cruelty, suppressive nature of the Chinese government. They do fight against.
So I just want to say something, first of all, about how much I admire Doris Liu, because it's not as if there aren't repercussions for them. I mean, one thing you may ask yourself is, if there's all these problems, why are we having certain people who have certain issues representing, and not just academics? But one of the things you have to understand is that academics self-censor, because if you're involved in China studies in any way, it's a very uneven playing field in terms of the CCP's total control over information and who comes in and out of the country versus the way we operate in a two-party state. That has to have a certain element of nonpartisanship in relationship nation-state to nation-state. China doesn't have to have that. So our scholars on China, whether they're of Chinese descent or not, right, they have to think twice before they talk about any of these issues, because they might not get a visa to go back to China and do their research. And then the very thing that they work to get a PhD for and to write their books about, they're blocked from doing. And that's a really real thing, and it's part of why you're not hearing as much from scholars on China about this as you might otherwise think you should be.
Yes, I just have two questions. One for Ms. Liu. I think it was mentioned in your documentary that they said that Dalai Lama was a demon. Was that actually in the written materials? I'm aware that this is the 60th anniversary since the Dalai Lama left his country. He lives in exile in India. Perhaps you could touch on the 3 T's, Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen Square massacre, that these are like 3 topics that are avoided. And then for Ms. Ruth, do we know what the current budget is for the Confucius Institute here at PSU? And is the current contract between Hanban and Portland State University available online? I did not see it on the PSU website.
Thank you for your question. I believe that was, you saw that was a Chinese-Canadian parent, right, who was asking question to the former chair of the board. I believe she wanted to say Dalai Lama was portrayed as a demon, but to my experiences, I never saw in Chinese textbooks to say Dalai Lama was a demon, but rather than saying Dalai Lama was a separatist. Yeah, so I think that, you know, English is her second language, just like English is my second language. So in that circumstances, she chose the, I believe chose the wrong word, but yeah.
But aren't separatists almost equivalent to terrorists in the language that the CCP uses? So if you're a separatist, it's not that you are advocating for a different kind of political organization, it's that you're a terrorist. So those are really good questions, and I have seen the budget. I can't quote it offhand, I should have come more prepared. The budget, how much money we get from Confucius Institute. Hanban rents are a lot of space in the Carl Miller Center, so we get some money through that as well as the free classes. PSU wants to, the administration wants to draw a very hard distinction between the fact that we do not at PSU allow for credit-bearing classes paid for through Hanban and the Confucius Institute, only non-credit-bearing. My issue with that, though, is that is an issue of academic freedom and academic integrity. If you're affiliated, and I agree with the concerns that there's no safety controls for operating a Confucius Institute at a university, it would have to ultimately turn into money with no strings attached, run entirely by professors and scholars and experts hired by ourselves. And it would turn into something that could look at the Uyghur concentration camps as easily as it could look at the history of calligraphy. And that is not the situation now. We can talk about calligraphy all we want, we can't talk about the Uyghurs with the Confucius Institute. So they would have to turn into something that I don't think the party would be comfortable with, period. The way that we approached it at PSU, first of all, I'm not faculty senate, I'm union. The union recommended this resolution, Senate has passed it, I can't speak for Senate. But I do know that there's such varying degrees of knowledge about this, that to come out of the gate, especially in this truly xenophobic moment in American culture with Trump, to come out of the gate saying we want to terminate the Confucius Institutes would have been a non-starter. It would have been seen, all of the complexity of these issues wouldn't get digested. So even though there may be something naive about hoping to renegotiate, I don't see strategically that we had any other option for pursuing opening up this conversation.
Is the contract available online?
No, but that's one of the stipulations of the resolution, is that it be made available. Thank you.
I want to answer another part of your question about the Tiananmen Square massacre. Because I also, like Doris Liu, I grew up in China. I was told, that happened when I was in elementary school, and I was told nobody died on Tiananmen Square, and I believed that for 10 years. Until I went to Peking University, where that was a headquarters for the student protesters. Then it's like urban legend, right? So like people told me, okay, that's the building that we had this Tiananmen protest. And I'm like, did anyone die? Yes, of course, people died. Then I realized I've been cheated for 10 years, right? And then I went to talk to the PSU-CI director, the Chinese side director, and I asked him, so do you know anyone died during the 1989, Tiananmen Square thing? And then he said, well, we don't have any evidence, or we don't know whether anyone died because we have not seen evidence of that. That's from the PSU-CI director. And I'm like, that's unacceptable. And I have been cheated for 10 years, and he's still sowing the seed of doubt in people's mind here on PSU campus, and I totally cannot accept that. Okay, any other questions?
So I believe that the former director of the school board, he called the mother coming to him like xenophobic, or said that the beliefs were xenophobic. And I thought that was very interesting because from what was portrayed, the institute is not wanting to share more on other like groups and practices, and don't really allow that information to be shared. So I'm wondering if the people kind of saying that those who oppose the institute are like xenophobic or anti-Chinese culture and language, if they actually believe that, or if they are again motivated by money, and if the director was possibly found of like receiving any sort of like compensation or money or personal benefit for wanting to bring the institute to Toronto.
I think the xenophobia or racism or anti-China are the very convenient labels used by the Chinese government to put to anyone who is critical to the government or to the CCP regime. So some Westerners who are very close to the PRC or CCP would like to use those labels to put on anyone who is critical. Like I myself as a Chinese, how could I be racist to Chinese culture? I love people to learn my home language and culture. So I think that's my advantage to standing out, to speaking out on this issue as a Chinese myself.
I'll bring it to the back.
So I have a question, but I also wanted to point out that I do think there was, well, you talked about the xenophobia during this era of Trump, right? There was a couple, even though you can't blame it all on xenophobia when you shut down the Confucius Institute, right? Some of the protesters there, the costumes they were wearing and the signs they were showing were absolutely xenophobic. So a lot of the the guys that were like the extermination suits with the gas masks and stuff, in that sense, a signal like we're exterminating people, isn't it? I mean, I feel like some of the visual and the language involved in the protesters wasn't a largely xenophobic. So I guess I was wondering what's the impact of this. I mean, we can talk about it on the college campus, talk about I guess everybody in this room might have an understanding of why we don't want Confucius Institute and say at PSU. But when you get the mob mentality to protest like that, and you get tons of people involved that might not have the backing, the understanding for why they're doing it, then at a certain point it does kind of flame xenophobia. But then my question would be, where can I find like resources? Like I was looking up on here what elementary schools in Portland have classes. How can I acquire like a textbook? So I could look through it and actually see what are they teaching kids in those classes. Is there a place I can get those resources?
That's hard. I did case studies at 12 Confucius Institutes, and none of them would let me take home a textbook and have it. I mean, I think all you can do is ask. Doris, did you successfully take home a textbook?
At a very early stage, when I just visited one of the Confucius Institutes, which is very close to Toronto, I brought a Canadian, like a black guy with me, and pretend my friend was interested in learning Chinese, so the CI staff allowed us to bring a couple materials back home. Yeah, but I will say not each and every Hanban textbook contains a propaganda in it, but there's certainly have the propaganda materials in the books, but not each and everyone has that. And also, sorry, I wanted to add up to the xenophobia thing. The protesters I believe they were Tibetan people, the youth, and in their eyes, they thought the Confucius Institute was like cancer or like poison. Like they're poison people with propaganda, with censorship, all the anti-universal value things. So that's in their eye. They're not targeting China. They're not targeting Chinese culture. They're targeting the Chinese government. So I think when we talk about China, I know it's for sure, it's convenient, use China. But we do need to make very clear distinction between China as country, as nation, as people, Chinese people, as culture, and the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party, because that's the tricky thing that the PRC and CCP has been brainwashing people to believe all those concepts are one, China. If you criticize the PRC or Chinese government or the CCP, you criticize China. That's the purposeful brainwash.
You could also just ask PPS if you could have access to some of those materials. I think one other issue to bring up as far as it being in our schools is even if you were to look at the material and say, well, I don't see anything anti-American or pro-communism here. One thing to also consider that I think about a lot is how many of our permanent residents and Chinese Americans who have the skills to teach Chinese are not being hired by our own school districts because we're getting this free influx of labor. Whenever you have free labor, it throws off the whole labor market. And I know people who have moved here and who are taking jobs, who are school teachers in China, who are taking jobs quite beneath them because we have such draconian rules about getting certificates or professional credentials to teach in our district, but we let the Confucius Institute, because it's free, come and without any of those rules.
Hi everyone, my name is Sylvia and I'm a board member of Apologies for Muslim Association for Public Affairs. So actually in October, just before my question, I'm just gonna quickly share so in October last year, we had the opportunity to brief with Congresswoman Bonamici with our concerns of CI, so it's Confucius Institute. And our briefing was mainly based on this state research report by U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. And the title of this report If anyone's interested, it's an open public report you can find online. The title of this report is China's Overseas United Front Work. It's very, very interesting. Even for me as a Taiwanese, it's eye-opening. So I encourage you to look it online if you're interested in more about the United Front Work in China. So my question is, where do we stand here in Oregon in regard of our concerns with CI in PSU? There's actually another one in the University of Oregon, or Oregon State University. There's two CI in the university here in Oregon. But where do we stand here in Oregon? What can we do to take actions to either end the relationship with CI, or at least to make dramatic changes to allow academic freedom and speech freedom? What can we do in Oregon to change the situation here? Thank you.
I guess maybe the only parent of kids in PPS, and my children, with both my daughters, went through the Mandarin Immersion program that was started very, very early by the State Department. And the difference is the State Department hires citizens, some of whom are very, very pro-China, pro-CCP. They live here, but they will grow up in China. Some of whom aren't, right? You have the same range, because there can't be any kind of discrimination or political questions about political affiliations when the school, our district hires people, right? So anyway, my kids went to Mandarin Immersion, and what we can do, we can definitely lobby PPS, because actually I think that's a little bit, we have a lot of Confucius classrooms through PPS. Taiwanese parents, and of course every country, some Taiwanese are pro-China, some are really freaked out by what's going on. So, but the ones who are freaked out, get them to mobilize and lobby, and the Tibetans and Muslims who know what's going on in Xinjiang, to lobby PPS, because it's heartbreaking to think that you're a parent who came here and were persecuted in China, and now your kid's in a public school in America and is not being allowed to hear all the realities.
I think awareness, the very important first step to know the truth, and share with people about what you know about the issue, and mobilize more people. And then eventually you can take action to do some technical strategies to do things like suggested.
I think we have time for one last question.
So my question is actually about Falun Gong in the documentary. And I've looked into Falun Gong a little bit before. So when you're talking about like religious discrimination, I've heard Falun Gong be defined in different ways. So would you define Falun Gong as a religion? Would you define it as a spiritual ideology? And what would you say are the ideologies and the belief systems within Falun Gong in like a very like plain, unbiased language?
Yes, of course, because the main character in my film practiced Falun Gong as well as her mother, who is still under very close watch by the Chinese authorities and who cannot get a passport. I studied Falun Gong and did some research, and based on my research and my personal understanding, I think Falun Gong is rooted deeply in the traditional Chinese culture and philosophy. Throughout 5,000 years of China's culture history, it's been a culture and history of self-improvement and cultivation, and Falun Gong is very in line with that philosophy, and the principles of Falun Gong is truthfulness and compassion, forbearance, which are very good. I would bet everyone will agree with that. But unfortunately, since 1999, the movement, Falun Gong movement, has been under severe persecution by the PRC and CCP, and I believe, just based on the number of people who practice Falun Gong and who are under this persecution, I would believe the Falun Gong group would be the #1 targeted and persecuted community in mainland China, and a lot of horrible things and unbelievable things happening to this group. For example, Sonia's mother was put into jail for 2 years and almost lost her lives, and just for practice truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, which to me it sounds really good. And some other people, I believe as many as tens of thousands, if not million, Falun Gong followers or practitioners are persecuted to death. And some are died from live organ harvesting, which is hard to believe. Which means when the practitioners still alive, his or her organs are taken away by Chinese doctors and sell for wealthy people, Chinese or foreigners, who can afford that price to make profit.
An independent European Commission found that there was evidence of that. There was rumors about it and everything, and it's an independent group that had no affiliation looked into it and said, yes, this is true.
Right, because I'm a Canadian already, and the independent investigation into this organ harvesting, like forced live organ harvesting allegations, was actually done by 2 individual Canadians. One was a long time serving of members of parliament, who himself was a prosecutor, and another investigator was is an international human rights lawyer, and both investigators were nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. So I personally believe all those investigations, and I believe the real situation would be even worse than that. Like I taught at a Chinese university before I immigrated to Canada. I heard, while I was in China, I don't know them personally, but I heard a teacher in English literacy department or school who practiced Falun Gong were first monitored and then removed from her teaching post, which means lost income, and eventually she was tortured and injected the medicine, which will destroy her nerve system or immune system, so she became kind of insane or something. And another case was a professor and who is an expert in environment, who gets award by the Chinese government as well. She practices Falun Gong and she was put into jail. That's the 2 people I heard of that happened in my university where I taught. And of course, while I was in the university, the persecution against the Falun Gong happened, and we as teachers in the university were all notified and requested by the authority to keep an eye on your own student or faculty members and report to the university authority whoever practices Falun Gong. And I know some graduate or postgraduate students were just couldn't finish their study, not because they're poor in academic study, but because they practice Falun Gong. So, to answer your question, I think Falun Gong, if you discuss from the Western standard, it could be seen as a religion. But if you look at this movement from the Eastern or Chinese angle perspective, it's not a typical religion, because it doesn't have any ritual to worship or organize or name list. It's very, very freestyle, I would say. There's no organization among this community, and everyone is just coming to study or practice if you wish. If you don't want to, just leave. But no one knows you even.
Okay, so I would like to add on the question about what we can do. I think it was really helpful, and as I comment, for taking this initiative. I mentioned before, there is a coalition of Tibetan, Chinese, Taiwanese, Uyghurs members, everyone together who are concerned petitioning to the administration. Tibetan students actually started an online petition recently, and I think over 1,000, almost like 1,000 people already signed it, asking the Board of Trustees to consider this important issue and concerning our raising our concern. And I think every one of you here, especially who are part of PSU family, you can also directly write to your administration and raise your concern. And some of the questions that was raised before regarding His Holiness Dalai Lama, like how Chinese communist regime attack him, and in a very disrespectful, which every Tibetan inside and outside, we feel so pain when such things are being said. And as we know that His Holiness has been sending the message of peace and non-violence throughout the 60 years of occupation of Tibet. He was the one who guided us believing in non-violence, fighting for our rights and be hopeful that justice will prevail. And that's why he's respected globally. But the Chinese government is attempting to undermine him. And in fact, His Holiness Dalai Lama for at least last over 30 years has been proposing the middle way approach, telling Chinese government that Tibetans can live with genuine autonomy, but his request has been denied, and furthermore, attack him and try to criticize, which has not helped on the issue of Tibet. And Chinese government is completely blamed on all the incidents that's because of their own actions. But I must remind you that as we are discussing about the Confucius Institute here, I think Confucius Institute is just a tip of the iceberg. There's so many things happening, and Tibetans have the most experience dealing with China and the Chinese Communist regime. Because of the occupation, over 1.2 Tibetan million people died. And when you see Tibetan people here, there are people whose immediate family member passed away, and even right now facing these challenges. And what we see right now, the concern in terms of the democracy, the issue that we are facing here, what Xi Jinping is trying to take the advantage of the situation. And because I'm not an expert, I'm an activist, I meet a lot of people at the forefront, grassroots people, activists from Taiwan, from South Asian countries, even smaller countries whose democracies are in struggle right now. And what Xi Jinping is trying to sell is the Chinese system is working, one-party system is working. Mm-hmm. And that is something we need to be really careful. And that really challenged the free society that we are practicing here. And Xi Jinping recently changed the constitution and now tagging himself as the leader of China, as an emperor forever. And there was a time that 20, 30 years back when the Western democracy countries trying to deal with China, and we have been telling them, it's not a new thing for Tibetans. We have been telling them over and over the years, you have to be careful because we cannot trade our freedom and principle with, with the economy and the benefit with China. But nobody listened. But now what we are seeing is people are seeing things. And after dealing with China, after opening with the Chinese Communist regime, things have gone from bad to worse. So we have to think about that. Our society, free society, is under threat. It is not about the issue only about the Tibetans or the Taiwanese or the Chinese people inside. It's our future of the international community who want to be respected in human rights and free society. So I think we have to be really careful, and the Confucius Institute is just a small sign that we are seeing, and there are much more, and especially when the corporations are being traded with China, when Google tried to enter in China with a search engine, special search engine for CCP, we have to be careful on that. Because of that, there are people concerned, even Google employees are concerned, so corporation, everyone. So I think people who believe in democracy and human rights, we should stand together and and of course, like people here in Portland and Oregon, like PSU is something that is concerning, and community here are haven't given our hope, like Tibetans for over the last 16 years. No matter how difficult situation, we will never give up our hope for freedom and justice. And the community of coalition needs your support. So with that, I want to end, and I hope like we will continue our cause together. Thank you so much.
And that was very, I shouldn't say anything because that was very inspiring, but I do want to add that it's academic freedom with the Confucius Institute, and I completely agree that things have gone from bad to worse. It used to be in China that there was a sense that opening up eventually and democracy was better, but that's not even the narrative anymore at all. And I have real concerns about whether you can have academic freedom in a one-party state. So this is a fight for democracy, I agree.
Last thing I want to say is the documentary is, you can check it out from the PSU library, we have a version, and you can watch it or you can show it in your classroom, small classroom. So feel free to do that.
I also brought 5 copies of DVD, and in case anyone wants to purchase one, $15. So please do share what you've learned today with all your friends.